Ave Maria. Welcome to the Cornerstone, our series on the motive for the Incarnation. Why did the Word become flesh? And reflections on the practical implications of that. We're continuing our look at St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor. And as we noted before, St. Thomas held as a more probable opinion, he preferred that if man had not sinned, the Word would not have become flesh. So for him, the primary reason, the cause of the Incarnation was sin, man's need to have a remedy for sin. But he'd also held that the other opinion, which has come to be known as the Franciscan thesis, held by Blessed John Duns Scotus, was also probable. I'd like to read you a quote from his commentary on the sentences. He writes, "Others, however, say that since not only redemption from sin, but also the exaltation of human nature and the consummation of the entire universe was accomplished by the Incarnation, therefore, if there had been no sin, he would have become incarnate for these reasons. And this opinion, says St. Thomas, can also be called probable." So why this great respect for the opposite opinion when he leaned towards the no sin, no incarnation opinion? Perhaps this is due to the fact that two of his great professors at the University of Paris both held what has come to be known as the Franciscan thesis. First, Father Alexander of Hales, who was a professor for both St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure, he held that the redemption was not the primary motive or the cause of the Incarnation, but He's good, and good is diffusive of itself, and so the Incarnation flowed from His goodness. And also he felt that by reducing the motive of the Incarnation to a work of redemption was to make the means, the Word made flesh, God's masterpiece in all creation, reducing it, the greatest work, to something lesser, which would be man's redemption. And this was illogical in the eyes of Father Alexander of Hales. Also very interesting was the Dominican professor of St. Thomas, St. Albert the Great, another doctor of the Church. He also held that, as far as he was concerned, that this opinion was the better opinion because it was more in harmony with the piety of faith. He held it not as a doctrine but as an opinion, but he did side with what's called now the Franciscan thesis. So St. Thomas has a great respect, obviously, for both sides, both opinions. I'd like to look also at some things that St. Thomas has pointed out to us and to draw out some other points that show how the Franciscan thesis is not only probable but plausible, and then we will be delving into Blessed John Duns Scotus. St. Thomas, as you know, mentions that the Incarnation is fitting on the part of God because it's fitting that the highest good should be communicated to the creature because of God's goodness. So for St. Thomas, the Incarnation is fitting because of God's goodness, not because of man's need for sin. Second point, St. Thomas points out that for our redemption from sin, and we are sinners and need redemption, however, God in His omnipotence could have worked out our redemption in many ways. That's what he says in Article 2, Question 1 of the third part of his Summa. So it wasn't strictly necessary that the Word become flesh to redeem us from sin. And in that same article, he points out 5 motives for the Incarnation that are apart from any consideration of sin. On all 5, he quotes St. Augustine. First of all, he mentions that it would increase our faith if truth himself would become flesh and establish faith in our human nature. Second, it would increase our hope because the Incarnation, as we know, is the greatest manifestation of God's love. And this manifestation of His love in the flesh would increase, certainly, in a magnificent way, our hope. Thirdly, it would increase our charity. Because, as he quotes St. Augustine, that basically because God loves us first, and in this maximum way possible by the Incarnation, our love would be enhanced because we're responding to love incarnate, love come in the flesh. A fourth point he makes, a fourth motive for the Incarnation, apart from any consideration of sin, is that we have the supreme model. In other words, we can see from God come in the flesh how to live, how to practice virtue, how to do good in this life. And finally, because by the Incarnation we are given a participation in the divine nature. He quotes St. Augustine, who says, "God became man so that man might become God." Rings a bell. Sounds like something the priest says at Mass. Perhaps you've heard the priest in the secret prayer. He says, "By the mingling of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity." That's the sacred exchange. Jesus takes our frail, fragile human flesh, and then he enables us to participate in his divine nature. It's called divinization or deification by the Greek fathers, and they consider this, quite apart from sin, as a great positive blessing of the Incarnation. St. Thomas points all these things out, and yet he still prefers the opinion that if man had not sinned, God would not have become incarnate. At least we've seen from these points that the Franciscan thesis is even plausible in the eyes of St. Thomas. I'd like to conclude this reflection today with a thought from St. Teresa, Benedicta of the Cross, that great Carmelite nun who was killed in Auschwitz, also known as Edith Stein, a great thinker of the 20th century. You know, she had to, under obedience, translate works of St. Thomas Aquinas from Latin into the German. And one of the sisters at Recreation said to her, "You know, Sister Teresa, what do you think of St. Thomas?" And she says, "Oh, I love St. Thomas." She says, "I follow him in everything. But when it comes to the Incarnation, I follow Scotus." So come back and see why. God bless you.